So to make plain how occupation affects everyday life, I will walk through what my life would look like if I lived in Israel-Palestine compared to Saadik's life. If I were to decide to immigrate to Israel-Palestine, I would have full citizenship rights merely due to my lineage. So yes, it is absurd that there are 4 American Jews up here talking to you about everyday life in the occupied Palestinian territories, but it is also true that based solely on our religious heritage, we each could have a daily life in Israel as citizens. In contrast, Saadik and his family, who are all born and raised there and live there now, are not citizens of Israel, nor are they citizens of any nation. They are stateless, without nationality. They are considered residents of East Jerusalem. Residency, unlike citizenship, can be revoked by Israel, and since 1967, approximately 14,000 East Jerusalem residents have lost their residency status. No statehood means no passport. That makes international travel quite difficult and often impossible. Saadik has not left since 1998. To come to live with us in the first place, Saadik had to apply for special documents, and until about a week before he came, we thought it wasn't going to happen. So before I go on, I do want to say that Saadik and his family do have some significant privileges compared to Palestinians living in other parts of the occupied territories. So in contrast to West Bankers, East Jerusalemites don't cross a checkpoint to get to most economic hubs or the ocean. Their car is marked with the yellow Israeli license plates, distinguished from blue plates of cars registered in the West Bank. And these yellow plates make travel within the 48 borders and even travel back and forth across the checkpoints to get to the West Bank much easier. They certainly have more freedom of movement than Gazans, who are primarily trapped on a tiny strip of land, referred to many as the world's largest open-air prison. However, the rights of East Jerusalem residents are far from equal to the rights afforded to Jewish Israeli citizens. If I were to live in Israel-Palestine, I would live in a house or apartment building that is supplied with water from the aquifer. Most of the water, in fact, comes from an aquifer under the ground in the West Bank. This would be true if I lived in Tel Aviv, if I lived in Jerusalem, or even if I lived in a settlement in the West Bank. However, Saadik's house, like all Palestinian homes in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, is topped by a black water tank that stores water because they are not hooked up to the aquifer and their access to water is tenuous. My water consumption would rival the average American's, would rival my water consumption here, whereas Saadik's water consumption and access is like that of developing nations. I too am a social worker, and in fact, it turns out, I didn't realize this, Saadik and I both worked for the same social service agency in New York. However, my housing and thus my job opportunities would include many different cities, Haifa, Tel Aviv, Beersheba, whereas Saadik must live in East Jerusalem and as a result has many fewer job opportunities. Good thing he's doing so well with his. Saadik's sister lives in Ramallah, approximately 12 miles away from him, but there's a huge military checkpoint in between them, so he says he visits about once a year. If my sister and I both lived in Israel-Palestine, there would be no checkpoint in between us, and we would be able to casually visit whenever we chose without interacting with an occupying military force. To get there, I would fly in and out of Tel Aviv without harassment, whereas Palestinians who live in the West Bank and East Jerusalem are not allowed, without special permission, to fly through that airport and must travel to Amman, Jordan to get on an airplane. That's assuming they could get access to a temporary passport. I could live in a kibbutz or a moshav, which are kind of these communal settlements, communal areas, neighborhoods. To live in either a kibbutz or a moshav, there's a private admissions committee that first must approve who lives there. Generally, the admissions committees won't allow Palestinians to live in their communities. In 2010, the Israeli parliament passed legislation in response to Arab-Israeli accusations of discrimination that allows admissions committees to still exist, but bans them from considering applicants on the basis of race, religion, sex, ethnicity, country of origin, etc. Yet, the practice hasn't changed as a result of the legislation because the law allows committees to reject applicants deemed, quote, unsuitable to the social life of the community or the social and cultural fabric of the town, which can include having a Zionist vision. Furthermore, on a kibbutz, where people don't own their own homes, property is formally not sold but rather leased. The land of the entire settlement is owned by one entity, usually the Jewish National Fund through the Israel Land Administration, which leases out individual plots only to members of the cooperative. The Jewish National Fund, the owner of the land in many of these communities, views itself as a Jewish organization whose mission is to care for the land of Israel on behalf of the Jewish people everywhere, and therefore refuses to lease to non-Jews. I could marry whomever I'd like without threatening where I could live. However, if one of Sadek's daughters wishes to marry a Palestinian from the West Bank, she would likely have to choose between living with her spouse or her East Jerusalem residency, as residency status does not transfer through marriage nor to children. To live with her family, she would need to apply for family reunification, which since the passage of the Nationality and Entry into Israel law in 2003 is virtually impossible to receive. Public schools my children would have access to would be much better resourced than the public schools in East Jerusalem, and the curriculum would teach that my people are the heroes, victors, protagonists of history, without pressure from the Israeli government to impose another narrative. As a side note, Sadek sends his daughters to private school. He went to private school in Bethlehem in the West Bank, and he remembers having to sleep at the school during the First Intifada because it was unsafe to travel back and forth to his home. If my family member was diagnosed with brain cancer and needed access to specialized treatment where I lived, as is the case with Sadek's sister-in-law, if we had the money, I would likely be able to expand my home through a building permit. Palestinians who apply for building permits are routinely denied, and if they then build without it, they are at risk of having their homes demolished under the guise of illegal and unsafe building because it was done without a permit. Although Sadek's family probably does have the financial resources to do so, they did not expand their home, and now they rather live in a much tighter quarters, squeezed in with twice as many family members. In fact, rather than experiencing housing squeeze that Palestinians in East Jerusalem face due to extreme housing shortage, I would be offered subsidies to live in illegal settlements in the occupied territories. If I lived in a settlement beyond the separation wall or apartheid wall, depending on what you want to call it. In contrast to Sadek's journey to Ramallah, my journey would be on a superhighway that gives little indication, if any, that I'm in the West Bank. I would have voting rights to elect members of the parliament and the prime minister. As you might guess, stateless people do not get to vote in the occupying state's elections, even though they must pay Israeli national insurance, income tax, and municipal taxes and are subject to Israeli laws. The mere existence of my family would be applauded rather than referred to as a demographic threat in academic writing and mainstream news. My children would be required to serve in the army that is the occupying power of Sadek's family land. And in truth, from what I understand about the segregation of Jewish Israelis and Palestinians in East Jerusalem, if I had lived in Israel-Palestine when I was 10, I probably would have never known Sadek at all.